Thank you all so much. My name is Eve Porcello. You can find me at Eve Porcello online. I also have a GitHub repo set up for today's talk, workshop, whatever I want to call it. We are going to get to a lot of fun stuff, so let's get to it. I'm here from Tahoe City, California. I live in the woods. I rode the subway today. It was a big accomplishment. I shaved my full beard to be here today because I care so deeply about GraphQL. I work at MoonHighway. MoonHighway is my company with my husband, Alex Banks. We teach JavaScript, Node, React, GraphQL in person and online at LinkedIn Learning and Egghead.io. Sorry? Egghead.io. So Egghead, there's a ton of great video resources there. Is anybody an Egghead member here? No pressure? Yeah. Yeah, Egghead is awesome. So I'm going to talk for a minute while you can take that picture so you can sign up. Sure. The GitHub repo, I'll show it many times today, but github.com/Eve Porcello and then wise-GraphQL. All right. So, yeah, I also wrote these books. The one on the left, maybe not the best time to read that one. That one's a little old, but hooks and suspense and all of those things are going to be covered in the newest edition, which should be out early next year. The animals are in color now, and we'll have new things in that book. So I'm here today to talk to you about GraphQL. GraphQL is a query language for your API. And let's just get to it by starting to write some queries with GraphQL. So GraphQL is used on many different projects. Companies like GitHub and Netflix and Expedia and others are making... Is anyone's company using GraphQL in production? Cool, where do you all work? Priceline. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Okay, great, nice. Cool, so yeah, other places too. We're just gonna take a look at a GraphQL API that is for a ski resort. It's a fake ski resort that I made up. What's up? We have a real one in Tahoe, exactly. This is not it, but I did spend a lot of time staying up late at night naming these lifts and trails. So whenever we want to explore a GraphQL API, if you haven't played around with one before, we can use a tool called Graphical, which you may have heard of before, or the GraphQL Playground, which is what you'll see here on the screen. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen is where we write a GraphQL query. A GraphQL query is how we ask for some data from our GraphQL API. So I'm going to start this, and hey, folks in the back, it's your responsibility. You're in charge for yelling at me if you can't see the screen. So please do that. And you're also allowed to pick between dark mode and light mode on any of our things. So I know we love dark mode, but yeah.
I know Insomnia supports it too. What are the shortcomings of Insomnia versus that?
We're going to talk about all that stuff a little bit later. So let's put a pin in that question, and if I don't come back to it, we'll talk about it. But we want to talk about some GraphQL quick stuff. Light or dark theme?
Dark.
Whoa. All right. I've heard the vote. Oh no, now it's not going to let me change it. I'm so stressed out now. I'm panicking. This is what I get for showing off. It's not the first time that's been an issue. All right, so let's see what we can do. Thank you. Let's clap for that. Not for me, for GraphQL Playground. So over here on the left side of the screen, I'm going to write my GraphQL query. Now, queries are made up of fields. So I'm going to send a query for all lifts, and then I'm going to request some specific fields on this lift. So I'm going to say name, status, and capacity for this lift. Now, as soon as I click play on that, we're going to send an HTTP request, a post request, to this endpoint that's at the center of the screen. And then I'm going to get this data back as JSON. Notice that the data that comes back looks exactly like the query. We're not getting any extra fields. There's a ton of extra fields that are actually part of our data source, but we're not getting anything more. We're just getting the fields that we request, nothing more and nothing less. Another cool thing that we can do with GraphQL is that we can change data. So queries are how we get data. Mutations are how we change data. So I'm going to send a mutation to set a lift status. So it's really windy outside, and we don't want people flying off chairlifts. So we're going to close one of these lifts. So I'm going to, by name, use this set lift status mutation. I'm going to send it the ID of the lift that I want to change the status of. And then I also want to change the status. So I'll say closed. And then I'm just going to hit enter so we can actually see that stuff. Then I'm going to request any fields that I want to get back. So this is going to allow me to check to see if this mutation has actually happened. I'm going to send another HTTP request to that endpoint, and I've changed the data. I get some data back, name and status. So queries are how we get data. Mutations are how we change data. And there's a third type of operation with GraphQL, and it's one. I'm not here to cause arguments between GraphQL and REST, because you can totally use both together. I'm not here to say that GraphQL is going to kill REST, because it certainly may not. But I will say that GraphQL subscriptions are a really cool way, a third way of handling data changes. And subscriptions work over WebSockets, and they're going to let us listen for data changes in real time. So anytime I have somebody changing lift statuses, we're going to see all of that happening in real time. So, for example, lift status change, name, status. As soon as I click play on that, it's listening. And let's say somebody else changes something over here, right? This is someone else. And then when I click play to send that mutation, we're getting all of those changes popping up in real time. So subscriptions are really cool. At Facebook, where GraphQL was created, you know how you can watch a live video and remember those heads, emoji heads that would fly up saying if someone was mad or happy or in love with the content that was on the screen? That was kind of the first use case of GraphQL subscriptions being used in production. So it was a really cool way of just listening for changes. Yeah, so lift status change is the name of the subscription. So here's another, it's like I planted you there to say that, because you're going to prompt me to say something else that I should have said earlier. Now, something that's really cool about a GraphQL API, if you've ever worked with a REST API where you're trying to maybe find out what's available, what data is available with that REST API, you might use a tool like Postman or something like that. You'll ping it, and if it isn't well documented, hopefully all of our REST APIs are perfectly documented, but it doesn't always happen like that. There's some trial and error in that process, right? With GraphQL, we have backing all of these queries, mutations, and subscriptions, a type system for our API. So this is showing us all of the queries, all of the mutations, all of the data change options, and here's that subscription there. Lift status change, that's going to listen for any of our changes in real time. How do I get this?
You type URL and you get it.
Oh, how do I get this to come up in the screen?
No, that's a schema from URL.
Yeah, how do I get this? Where does this come from? Any ideas? Any questions? That's not what I meant to say.
The server publishes the input.
I made it up, right? I wrote a schema. That's exactly right, is what you said. I put together a GraphQL server. A server is made up of a schema, which lists all of our types, all of our queries, mutations, and subscriptions. But it also gives us it also has resolvers. So resolvers are functions that are in charge of going and getting all of that data from wherever it lives. So GraphQL is not a database. GraphQL can get data from absolutely anywhere. So it's a really nice way of putting a gateway in front of all of our different services. Because you might have data that's living in tons of different spots. You probably do. So GraphQL gives you this layer that you can use to organize all of this stuff. So it's going to help you organize all of that data. So that's a quick look at a working API. But I want to try an experiment today because I want to, because I feel like you'll be nice to me here, hopefully. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask for a volunteer. Let me talk about what the requirements of this volunteer are before you come up. I'm going to ask you lots of questions publicly in front of this room. You can always say you don't want to answer certain ones of those questions, but I just need to interview you briefly for like a minute or two, and then we'll do something cool with it. So who would like to volunteer? No. Just basic questions. You can totally come up. Let's do it. Yeah, so no, this is not a GraphQL quiz. I'm not trying to stump anyone. We want to have a good time. I'm Eve, by the way. What's your name?
Stacy.
Stacy. Welcome, Stacy. Nice. All right, Stacy. Behind you, that looks like I put up weird stuff behind you. It's just JSON. Let's stay calm. It's fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to interview you, and we're going to ask you a few questions to populate some data about you, Stacy. So first, your name, Stacy. Y-I-E-Y. Perfect. And your last name.
It's T-O-K-H-T-A-M-Y-S-H.
One more time. Hopefully one more time I'll get it.
M-Y-S-H.
M-Y-S-H?
Yes.
Nailed it? Nice. All right, let me add this to my dictionary. That's in there for life. All right. Now, where do you live? Where's your location usually?
Brooklyn?
Brooklyn. And do you have a GitHub handle?
Yeah, but I don't remember it.
Okay, no worries. We'll get rid of it. Twitter handle?
It's... I don't really remember. Let's just be Stacy.
Stacy123. Everybody follow Stacy. EY. Sorry. Favorite color?
Blue.
Blue. Yeah, you can't get away with not having a favorite color. Favorite activity?
Of course, coding.
Of course, coding. Of course, coding. Awesome. So I have just a couple more questions. So that's our person data about Stacy. We've learned a lot. Not her Twitter handle yet. It's very mysterious, but someday we'll learn it. We also have some goals. So Stacy, we'd love to hear some goals that you have. They don't have to be big, lofty goals. They don't have to be coding related whatsoever. Just like a vacation you might want to go to. We're making a vision board, if you will, for all sorts of different things that you want to accomplish. And it's only 2 things, so no worries.
Well, the first one is obviously I want to master GraphQL. This is
Obviously. So master GraphQL. Perfect.
And get a job.
Perfect. And get a job. Love it. So what kind of job do you want to get? What description should we put on here?
Something related to GraphQL.
GraphQL job. Sweet. And how long do you want to take to get that job? Like
Tomorrow.
tomorrow. Cool. So we'll change this to days, and we'll say 1. And then master GraphQL, I think like 1, right?
Okay.
Sound good? Awesome. So now I need to just add some IDs. So I'm going to put your person ID. So you're 1, just like a real database. 1, 2, 3. So person ID, this is 2, 1. And then I shouldn't have done this. All right, so anybody else have a goal that they want to add? There's a point to this later. I'm not going to explain it now.
Yeah.
So to what?
To dunk on somebody.
17 SP3. Find 17 SPID3.
17. This database needs to get it together. Me. I am the database. Cool. You said to dunk on someone? That's a hostile goal, but I didn't say you couldn't do that. All right. And how long do you want to take for that, day-wise?
60 days.
60 days? That seems reasonable.
Work on my cash.
Work on my... Perfect. What a weird day. Cool. So, first of all, let's thank Stacy. Thank you so much. Thank you. And now that we have some data, we're going to put together our own GraphQL API. So I'm going to take you through the steps of building your own GraphQL server for Stacy so that she can use this as a data source in all of her personal applications. So our database at this point is JSON, but like I said, you can use any data source with GraphQL, absolutely any data source. So don't feel like it has to be a JSON file or a Mongo database or anything like this. You can totally use whatever you want. So let's do this. I want to open up, let's see. I want to first install a few dependencies that we're going to need to work on this project. So right here in our terminal, I'm going to run npm install on this public Wi-Fi, and we're going to install Apollo Server. Apollo Server is a Node.js server that we can use to build a GraphQL API. We also need to install one of its dependencies, which is GraphQL. And then I'm going to also install NodeMon so that my project keeps restarting and I don't freak out about it being broken in front of all of you nice people. So while that is being installed in the background, we're going to create the main file. That's fun. We're going to create the main file for this project, which is just going to be in an index.js file. How are we feeling so far? Good? Thumbs up? Great. Nice. Oh, wow. Awesome. Thank you for all playing along with that. So the first thing that I want to do with our GraphQL server, I'm going to start out by creating a schema. Remember our Snowtooth API from 10 minutes ago? This listed all of the types, all of the queries, mutations, and subscriptions that were available on our API. Now, when you set out to build your own GraphQL API, you're going to want to think about what your data looks like. What are the types? What are the objects that are part of your domain? So the objects that are part of our domain are this person. So we're going to open this up, and we're just going to create a schema that looks exactly like our data. So the first thing that we'll do, we're going to create this variable called typedefs. And this is just going to be a string. So I've put it inside of these backticks on the left-hand side of the screen. Now, the next thing that I want to do is, based on the data that we have here, we probably want to create what?
Fields.
Yeah, we want to create fields, but what type do we want to create? Person. Awesome. So let's create a person. This person is going to have an ID. And GraphQL has a type called ID that we can use to model this field. Next up, we're going to create a first name, which is a string. We're also going to create a last name, which is a string, a location, which is a string, a Twitter handle. Yeah, totally. But we're in charge of what we want the schema to look like, so.
Why you not putting exclamation after location?
I don't know, why? Go ahead.
The exclamation point means it doesn't change. Without it means it can change.
Close. Who else we got?
Means it's required.
Exactly. So as I just drink LaCroix very loud into a microphone, what the exclamation point means is non-nullable. So this means that if I query this data in the playground, I can't return null for one of those fields if it has this exclamation mark. So do we want to make location required? Well, sure. I'm going to say that Twitter handle isn't required because this one seems like fake to me. And then we'll also use favorite color, another string. There's a lot of strings in this data. And we can use favorite activity, which is, of course, coding, but we'll make that also a string. So we've created a person. This looks like our data. And this is a model using GraphQL's Schema Definition Language, or SDL. Cool. So the next thing that I want to do is now that we've created our person, we want to start to see this thing working. So I'm going to set up my server. Remember I installed Apollo Server before? That's the server tool that I'm going to use. So I'm going to import this. I'm going to use require statements because I only have like an hour, so I'm not going to set up Webpack. We're going to require Apollo Server. And we're also going to pull in this package called GQL. It's a function that we're going to place right before that backtick there on line 3. And that's going to allow Prettier to work on this code because it's GQL. It's Schema Definition Language Syntax. Cool. So in addition to the type definitions, the schema that we need to make our app work, we also need resolvers. So as I alluded to before, resolvers are functions that go get the data from where it is. So in this case, our data lives in that JSON file. That's our database. So I'm going to go ahead and get it from there. So here's what this is going to look like. Let me just keep our resolvers empty for now. Let's also create this type here. So in our Snowtooth API, we have all these different queries, right? All lifts, all trails, lift, trail. We're going to use this query type to define all of the different queries that are part of our API. So if I want to ask for some data about Stacy, I can do so by first setting it up in the schema inside of this query type. So let's go ahead and add it. So we're going to say person, and person should return our data. So let's go ahead and import this as a variable from data slash, what is it called? Person. That's a good name for that. Person.json. Cool. So person, the function, should return this. And I'm writing it in the wrong place, so no one look at that. I don't make mistakes ever, except all day, every day, in every aspect of life. So line 17 is where we're going to define that query in the schema. Then we write the function inside of our resolvers. So take a look at that query type. That's going to look a whole lot like the function here on line 22. So we're going to say person, and then this is a function that returns person. Where does person come from? Here. It comes from the data. All right. So we're almost there. The next step is we need to set up our server. So what does our server need? It needs our type definitions, our schema, and our resolvers. So type defs, resolvers. From here, we're going to start our server. So we'll say server.listen, and then we'll chain on this then function. And then we're just going to console log a little message for ourselves so that we know which local host this thing is running on. So server listening on URL. Okay. So at this point, I feel like we're ready to run Oh, we can't see that at all. That's wild. All right, let's say npm start. This will say server is listening on localhost 4000. Back to our browser, we can open localhost 4000. And everyone stay calm. I'm changing it. That was close. All right. So now, a couple things are going on. Thing one is that our GraphQL endpoint is now localhost 4000. See it there in the center? That's our single endpoint that we are using with GraphQL. Secondly, we now have a query here, person, in our schema. And now we can type person as a query on the left-hand side of the screen. We can pull in the first name, the last name, the location, and all those different things. And when I click play, we get her data. Yeah. How awesome is that? So the pieces that came together to make that work are, again, the schema. And this is just that whole type system for the API thing, right? It's the description of all of these types. Then we have our query, which lists all of the queries that are available on the API. And then our resolvers go get the data for us. Then if we think of any other ideas of things that we want to add here, we can just simply add them to our schema. So let's say we wanted to add another type for our goals. So I forget what this data looks like, so I'm going to open it to the side here. And there we go. So this time I want to create a new type called goal. And this is going to help us to model our data. This has an ID also in our schema. I'm going to skip over that person ID thing because that doesn't necessarily need to be mocked in the schema. We're going to skip straight over to the name, which is a string, a description, which will be an optional string. And then for days, we're going to use int. There's also float in GraphQL as well. So one time I stood up in front of a conference and I was like, there's 5 scalar types with GraphQL. And then I forgot all of them as soon as my hand was in the air. And I was just like blocked. And I saw my husband's eyes. He's like, this is bad. So now I always know them. So it's ID, string, Boolean, float, and int, forever known. But thank you so much. So we didn't get to all of them, but you can use those anytime you just want to bring, or you want to pull up one value there. So we've created our goal.
And you're doing all this in the tool.
So I'm doing all of this. This is the playground. The playground comes with GraphQL, or Apollo server, I should say. So this is our tool that we can use to interact with a GraphQL API. All of this is VS Code. I'm just using VS Code as my IDE. You can choose whatever IDE you'd like. Question back there?
So you're not using delimiters between the fields, is it line-oriented?
Sorry?
You're not using delimiters between the fields, so you have like IDs on one line, I see it there, and then news, and then the next thing. You're not using commas or anything, so it's line-oriented.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. So here on, let's see. So this is JSON on the right. On the left, that's a JavaScript file, right? Index.js. However, we're using this GQL function here. And this is I just ruined it. Ugh. Yikes. So this is a string. This syntax that I'm using here, we notice there's no commas, there's no semicolons, there's no double quotes, there's nothing going on like that. And that's because this is another language. You all learned another language today, if you haven't worked with schemas before. That's pretty cool. So this is GraphQL's schema definition language. So taking kind of a step back, the query language that we used for sending this query about Stacy, this is all defined in GraphQL spec. It's the language that we use to write these queries to get some data. The schema definition language is also part of that spec. And that's what this looks like. We don't have any commas present because that's what the language tells us to do. That's the syntax that is asked of us. Cool. This is me waiting if anyone has questions. Go ahead.
So the server is just querying the databases for us, correct?
Yeah, so the server is, it's using the type system to describe what are all of the types and queries available. And then the server uses these resolver functions to go get that data.
Right, so like under the hood, it's just like Apollo servers using like SQL like queries to like get the data from the database. It's just like abstract memory for us.
Yeah, so it's a good question. So under the hood, Apollo server is using these queries. So basically, there's two sides to our GraphQL API here. This is the code for the server. We're using a node server to make this work. Resolver functions are going to go get the data wherever it is. That could be any database or of any sort. Then this is our client. So our client sends queries to that server. And what the server does under the hood, it's not using SQL or anything. SQL and GraphQL aren't the same. They have QL in the name, so they seem related, and they sort of are. SQL's like a grandpa. They share some things in common, but it's like a whole new thing, and he's like left town and is doing a whole other thing. But that makes no sense to anyone, including me. I understand that. The Apollo server, though, will validate those queries. So that if I type something that doesn't align with the schema, like cool lady from Meetup, that's not going to work, even though it's true. Really cool, really nice. But this isn't going to work because the server will not be able to validate that that's an actual query. So that's kind of how that relationship works. There's the server that goes and gets the data. And then the query is sent to that server. And the server validates the query as being aligned with the schema. Does that help a little bit? Ish? Yeah, it's a totally new way of thinking about data stuff. And that's what makes GraphQL pretty cool. And you don't have to understand 100% of it today, because I don't understand 100% of GraphQL at all. But this is a new way of thinking of like how we think about organizing and fetching data. Yeah.
If you have one person and you have a couple of people, and one person has like the location grouping and another queens, can you make a query how each related to each other by location or by something?
You can do whatever you want with GraphQL in the schema. So the schema provides the rules. The schema is the blueprint and the rule book for every type.
So if you type query person and you type location Brooklyn and you have 5 people in Brooklyn, all 5 will show up?
If you write your schema for that, yeah, absolutely. So all of that is developed by the schema. Why can I write a query called person that gets this data? Because I said you could in the schema, essentially.
And you want something like somehow they're related, like not by location, but by their hobby, for example. You write that in schema.
Yeah, all in the schema, absolutely. Yeah.
So I have 2 questions. The first one, is there like a query you have to write a special query to just get all your data back, like all your people, or?
So, right now our data is this.
Condition. Where is condition?
What's up? Don't get mad. Let's stay calm about GraphQL today. So your question is a great one. Let me add to our schema a little bit to pull lists. So right now our person is just a single object, right? We're pulling this one object. Typically our data is not a single object, but it more often than not is a list. Our goals JSON file is a list. So it's a list of objects that we can return. And I'll also get to the next question that I'm anticipating about getting all the fields from that query. Is that what you're asking? No.
Sure.
Okay. You're like, not at all. Great. So let me add a query for let's see. Let's add this query for all goals. Remember, we listed our goals, our visions, our hopes and dreams in this file. We're going to return a list. Anytime we want to return a list in GraphQL, the first step is to add this query to our query type. Then we're going to use the array brackets, and we're going to return a goal. So this is just saying return a list of these goal objects. Give me all of the fields that are part of the goal for each one of these.
Say where person is personal ID 1.
What's up?
Where personal ID for 1. Because maybe you have 100% one goal for space.
Yeah, so that's not what our data looks like right now, but we're going to get to it. So let's go with the all goals thing, and then we'll get to the next step. So the first thing I need to do is we need to pull in we need to pull in goals rather. Require data/goals.json. That's kind of a long line, but this is pulling in our data source. Again, if you're using Mongo or Postgres or your favorite database of choice, these resolver functions are where you're going to write a function that goes and gets the data from that source. So you'll use just a regular, in this case, JavaScript function. And then you could just use your database functions that you know and love right here. So in this case, though, we'll keep it simple and just return the goals from this JSON file. Cool. So at this point, what I can do is I can say, and even though I have NodeMon running, I still have to hit refresh in order to get that schema change to work. The query would work if I typed it, but then it looks all red and it stresses me out like I'm misspelling stuff, so I always like to hit a refresh on that. We're going to be able to access all of the fields that are part of the goal. So we'll say name, description, and days. Notice that I didn't take this person query out of the query itself. I can send one big query and get data from all sorts of different sources, or send multiple queries in the same thing. So now I'm getting back all of our goals. How cool is that? We have name, description, and days for each one of these. Even Dunk on Someone made it. Cool. Now, the question was sort of coming up about filtering. So how do we filter this data? Like anything with GraphQL, it starts with the schema. So we need to build that into the schema to say, let's say I wanted to filter goals by ID, for example. I want to find a goal by ID. All I need to do in this case is I'll write a query, goal by ID. And then here we're going to, before the colon, we're going to create an ID argument. There's a bug by my face. I'm not losing it. So this is going to return, in this case, a goal. So on line 27 there, notice that we're saying this query is going to need an ID every time I send that query. And that's because I've used this exclamation point. Then I write the resolver. So I'll say goal by ID. And this is where I need to access these arguments. So when a user types in an ID to filter by this ID, I need to capture that from the user, right? So if I want to find this particular goal, I'll send number 2 of those goals, but I want to be able to capture that. So here's where I'm going to ask you all to trust me. The first argument that's sent to a resolver is called parent. And I'm going to put this on a fake bulletin board here as something I promise to talk about soon, but I'm not going to explain it right now because I'm going to move to the second argument, which is this thing called Args. So Args is an object of all of those arguments that are coming in via the playground or from the client. And then this is going to allow me to filter my data based on whatever that argument is. So here what I can do is just use good old JavaScript to find an object in an array. So I'll use goals.find, and I'm going to take in a goal So for each one of these goals, I'm going to look at the goal ID. And I'm going to close this now because I can't see. And I would assume neither can you. I'm going to write code right, and then I'll say goal.id, and then I'm going to compare that to the Args ID. Cool. Then I have it set up in the schema and the resolvers, so I can come back to the playground. I'll hit a refresh here, and I'll just add on to our big old query. And this time I'm going to say goal by ID. I'm going to pass in the ID of 3. And then I'll have access to the name, description, and whatever else. And you knew I was going to pick that goal. We find the goal that we're looking for. And then this will grab 2, get a job, 1, master GraphQL. Cool. So that's how we might add a filter to our data. Of course, this is a pretty simple example, but you can see how you can tap into your knowledge of JavaScript, or there are servers in many different languages. So if you're a Python person, C++ person, whatever programming language you want to use, there's probably a GraphQL server for that language. So it'll look the same. You'll still have a schema. You'll still have resolver functions that go get the data, but it'll be in your own language, which is cool. What questions do y'all have? Yeah, I felt them coming. Go ahead.
So resolver get involved each every request?
Yes, so resolver, good question. The question was resolvers get invoked for each request. Anytime that I request a field, a resolver function is going to be called for that. So it goes and gets the data every time I ask for one of these fields.
So it goes to the database, it doesn't cache whether there's a couple of requests in the same.
Yeah, so we can set up caching and all of that stuff to our GraphQL server. So GraphQL does a lot of cool stuff for us. It allows us to not overfetch data. It allows us to get these great developer tools in the browser that we can use to make our development cycles faster. We still have to do the work of scaling and caching and doing all of those types of things. We don't get anything. We get a lot with GraphQL, but we don't get everything with GraphQL, right? It doesn't do everything out of the box. However, there's a lot of great tooling in the ecosystem for setting up a server that does cache our queries on the server and the client. So that's a great question. Yeah, back there?
So you mentioned follow server for Node. Can you drop some names of possible implementations in either C or Python?
Yeah, so Graphene, great question. Other server libraries for other languages. Graphene is the big one for Python. If you go to graphql.org, there's a link at the top of the page for, calm down with zooming, for code. This will give you a list of all of the different server libraries. So if you love Go or Haskell or Scala or any of these are the ones that are used in production by a lot of companies. So yeah, there's a ton of these. So yeah, graphql.org/code, and I can add those to the repo after this course. Yeah.
Those are like MIT licenses?
Yeah, exactly. These are all open sourced, MIT. Exactly. Question there. Yeah.
So I just want to understand the data flow because like it seems that like you're doing a filter when it's coming back from the server, and so that's gonna raise a question for me as like, is it going to the database and getting all the goals first and then in the server that's when it's filtering, or like it's going to like get what you want from the server, from the database and then bring it back to the server, or is it getting everything from the database?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, how does the data flow work when we're asking for some data from the database? Does it go get everything, or like what is the timing on those things? Is that what you're asking? Great. So yeah, it really depends on how you write that function. So you could load all of that data you could request all of that data each and every time, which might Yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about performance stuff because we can always optimize that for our own specific situations. But yeah, you can use these database functions to go get the data whenever you want to, whenever it makes the most sense. So one of the coolest things about GraphQL is actually moving a lot of that logic to the server. We're doing a lot of heavy computation oftentimes on our phones, and REST, when we make a request to http://skiresort.com/lifts, we're getting these huge blobs of JSON data back to our phones, and then it's up to the client to parse it, sort it, filter it, do all the things it needs to do to turn it into the shape that can be displayed on the phone. With GraphQL, we can move a lot of that to the server. So I can say, and yeah, a lot of the database, if you are using a database with GraphQL, a lot of that does happen here in the resolvers. The transformation of data, the kind of shaping it up, happens on the server, which is probably a better place to do that stuff than asking lower powered devices to do that. So yeah, it's all an optimization game with GraphQL. Like moving it here gives us a lot of organization, but we still have to think about those things too. That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah.
In your shape docs, the all goals has an array around it.
Yeah.
Is that because you expect it to be more than one?
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, for person, we're saying just return a single person, return a single object. For anytime you see these square brackets, these array brackets, this is saying return a list. And it's saying return a list of goal types, so goal objects. So every one of those goals should have all of those fields that are part of that goal type. That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Is it related to GraphQL with graph database?
Yeah, it's not a graph database. That's a tricky thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really common misconception about GraphQL, that GraphQL is a database, and it's not. It's so much more than that. I'm not selling it that hard. But yeah, it is a little bit different. You could use GraphQL with a graph database, certainly, because you can use...
Graph database.
I'm sorry?
Query graph database with GraphQL.
Yeah, absolutely. You can query a graph database with GraphQL. Graphs on graphs on graphs on graphs. Were there other questions? Go ahead.
So you can use the types and queries to get like information, and you can use mutations to update the information. Is there like a third option to like create new information or delete information, or is that something different that you have to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So changing information is part of a mutation. The question was, you can get data with a query. You can use mutations to edit. Mutations are really intended for any sort of changes. So you'll use those for deleting records, for creating things, for editing things, for anything you want to do. Any sort of action that you want to use in your application, you can use a mutation for. Yeah.
Last question, please, to understand, because it's going deeper. You run that in that tool, and then how you use this data? Who define this data? Okay, you display in that tool, and then where it goes, who can use it? In the code?
Yeah, who wants to take that one? How do we use the data when we query it?
Yeah, in that tool, for example, then some
Sure.
code connect to this?
Well, this tool is intended to be used, so a couple things. This tool is intended to be used to just explore GraphQL APIs, essentially. So these GraphQL API tools usually look like this. We write our queries and get some data in a playground environment that looks like this, which is really awesome. But GraphQL applications, has anyone used Gatsby before? Gatsby is a tool that's used for, and if you haven't, that's totally fine. I'm not saying that to stress anyone out. I'm just saying behind the scenes of every Gatsby app, Gatsby is a static site generator, gatsbyjs.org, that uses a lot of GraphQL and JavaScript behind the scenes. So GraphQL is used behind the scenes of this website generation tool. So why would it use GraphQL? Because that's the way that it's getting data into those pages. There's also a ton of examples, Netflix and Expedia and PayPal and MoonHighway.com that use GraphQL behind the scenes to populate data for websites. So we'll use for our blogs, for example, all of this is mapped out. This is using Gatsby too, but all of this is mapped out as an article. You can look at a front end of any website and start to think about what are the types that might be on that page. We got an article. There's a date on that article. There's a title. There's all of the text that's part of it, those types of things. So I only say that to point out that the way that we use these queries is by integrating, we have a GraphQL server, right? That's orchestrating all of our data. It's like shadowy underwater stuff going on under here. Then we have all of our clients. And all of our public-facing clients, like our apps and our websites, things like this, they're consuming the data from those GraphQL API sources. So that's what it's all about, is it's just organizing that data in a way that will make it easier for you, particularly if you're a front-end developer, to start to get data from those data sources.
So if you build a website, you can use data you built today.
Absolutely. If you build, yeah, exactly. So, and that's a great point to bring up, which is that there are many different public-facing GraphQL APIs. One to play around with, certainly, is the Github API. So GitHub, for versions 1 through 3, had a REST API. They still do. But in version 4, they created this GraphQL API. And this will, let's see where it is. Explorer. This will allow you to actually query live data. This looks familiar, right? So I can look up myself because I'm logged in. I can pull information about myself in this way. It's just an alternative to having to write a bunch of requests to REST endpoints. But we also want to point out that these resolvers can get data from anywhere. And that's why a lot of companies have been making big bets on GraphQL, because it's fun to work with and you can wrangle all of your data from wherever it lives. She's on board. It took 50 minutes, but she's on board. Let's do it. Question there.
Just not so much question, observation.
Sure.
It would be pretty impressive, like you could, for instance, do mail protocols. Like you could replace IMAP with this.
Sure. Yeah, could you replace IMAP? Absolutely. Anytime, for any situation where you need data, GraphQL can probably step in. HTTP doesn't have to be the transport. I hinted at subscriptions, which run over WebSockets. So there's all sorts of cool things that'll be built with GraphQL. So with respecting everyone's time in mind, I'm going to pause you for 1 second. I just want to let you know, let's see, can I type? Time will tell. So let's see. I've put a bunch of links on this GitHub repo. Let me zoom way in, ePorcello/wise-GraphQL. There's this, you can look at the main docs, but there's also this free resource called howtographql.com. Howtographql.com will teach you how to do a lot of cool things with GraphQL, no matter what your interest is. If you're a back-end developer, front-end developer, check that out for sure. I also have my slides and a link to the Snowtooth API. So if you want to query some Lyft data and ski data or build your own app with it, you can. Send it to me though, because I would think that was cool. I've made a couple of courses.
Real resources? Like, there's a website for Tahoe result. Can it be?
You can create it, sure.
No, query.
Oh yeah, I don't think there's any GraphQL APIs for that stuff, but you could always make one. I'll use it. I also have some courses and stuff, but more importantly, I didn't put my email address on that. So I'll do that right now. Send me an email anytime you have any questions about GraphQL stuff. I'll hang out as long as you all would like. I'll also upload the code that we looked at today. With your permission, I'll change your data before I do that, because that's not what I put in as part of the caveats to coming and volunteering. But yeah, I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you very much. That's the link.